The December 12, 2019 meeting of the Williamsburg City Council will come to order. Ms. Felico, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Maslin?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Freiling?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Here.
Mr. Zhang?
Here.
We have no council minutes to approve, so we'll move on to matters of special privilege, of which we have none, which takes us right into the public hearings. We have two of those today. Both are very similar. So, Ms. Shelton, would it be appropriate to have one public hearing for both items and then vote on them separately?
You can have one public hearing and you can vote on them together. You just need to make clear in the motion that you're voting on them together.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I'll be recusing myself and leaving the ayes.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. The two items are ARB 19-123, request of BMZ Developments, LLC, to appeal the decision of the Architectural Review Board on November 12, 2019, to deny the request to replace true divided light windows with simulated divided light pine windows at 705 Goodwin Street, and ARB 19-124, request of BMZ Developments, LLC, to appeal the decision of the Architectural Review Board on November 12, 2019, to deny the request to replace true divided light windows with simulated divided light mahogany windows at 705 Goodwin Street. Ms. Burke?
Good afternoon, Mayor Freiling and members of council. On November 12, 2019, the Architectural Review Board denied the request to replace existing true divided light wood windows with new simulated divided light pine or mahogany windows at 705 Goodwin Street. At the meeting, the applicant's representative presented window samples and stated they would like to replace the windows in the house with one of the two proposed window products. The applicant's representative did not present any additional information at that meeting. The board denied the request because the design review guidelines state the existing wood windows should be retained and repaired, and if restoration is not possible, then copies of the original windows matching the existing sash frames with duplicates in wood form and details would be required. In your packet, staff attached the applicant's appeal letter, the ARB application for both the pine and mahogany wood windows, the minutes, staff comments, photographs of the windows taken by staff, letter of denial to the applicant, and design review guidelines, along with pertinent comp plan information. In addition to those items, the applicant has provided information and a presentation that was included in the packet. The zoning ordinance outlines the appeal process. This process was included in staff's memo. The Architectural Review article of the zoning ordinance states that the same standards shall be applied by the council as are established by the board. These standards include the criteria for approval listed in section 21-855C, the design guidelines adopted by City Council on October 13, 2013, and historic preservation and urban design from the 2013 comp plan. City Council needs to use these standards in deciding on the appeal from the Architectural Review Board's decision. This property is located in the Architectural Preservation District AP2 of the Design Review Guidelines, which were adopted by City Council on October 10, 2013. City Council needs to decide whether to affirm, reverse, or modify in whole or in part the decision of the Architectural Review Board for ARB 19-123 and ARB 19-124, the request of BMZ Developments, LLC, for the property at 705 Goodwin Street. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. The applicant and the applicant's counsel are also here.
Do my colleagues have any questions for Ms. Burke?
No, sir. I'd like to wait until after the presentation.
Certainly.
I'll do the same.
Okay. Before I open the public hearing, I'm going to ask Ms. Shelton a question. Ms. Shelton, as was the case in a recent appeal that came to council, I just want to make sure we all understand what our role is here in this appeal process, and that is to determine whether or not, in our opinion, the ARB has properly interpreted and applied the guidelines.
That's correct.
That's correct. It is not about the guidelines. It's not about any other concern about the project. It's specifically just that.
Yes.
Okay. With that, I'll open the public hearing. I'll give first opportunity to the applicant or applicant's attorney if they'd like to speak. And for everybody here, if you want to address council, right here, Mr. Tarley. Okay. When you come forward, if you could offer your name and address, and please keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less. Mr. Tarley, as the applicant, will give you 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Vice Mayor, members of council, my name is John Tarley, 112 Yorkshire Drive in Williamsburg, and our firm represents BMZ Development, and we're here to request the replacement of 20 rotting and unrestorable windows at the residence at 705 Goodwin Street. As you may know, the members of BMZ Development are Councilman Zhang and his mother. The request is replace those windows with Pella Architect Review Series ILT Integrated Light Technology windows, which will be wooden windows. And we believe that this request fits well within the discretion of the ARB and City Council pursuant to the design review guidelines. This is a photo of the owner's house at 705 Goodwin Street. It was constructed in 1952, and it wasn't included in the 1992 survey by Fraser and Associates on homes because it wasn't 50 years old at the time. As you can see, it's a nice and quaint house, no known historic or architectural significance, and because it wasn't included in the 1992 survey, we don't even know whether these are the original windows in the home, which is part of what's required in the guidelines. Our request is to replace all 20 of those windows with the Pella ILT windows. Again, as I stated, we don't know whether they're original, and so we suggest if council approves it, they can also approve the material, either pine or wooden, or mahogany, I'm sorry. We believe currently the wood is pine. And I, as council, as Mayor alluded to, there was a recent hearing on windows, and but that case is different than what we have today. In that particular case, the owners faced a notice of violation for replacing windows without approval when they needed ARB review, and they installed vinyl instead of wood windows. The owners here didn't replace any windows. They went through the proper channels, and we're proposing to replace wood windows with wood windows. And I'm going to divide the presentation into two parts. First step is the ARB never reached a decision on whether these windows were appropriate or whether they were compatible or whether they fit within the guidelines. The ARB may base its decision that the windows were, in its opinion, restorable or repairable. But other than staff's representation that some windows needed painting and putty work and that other windows needed even more work, there wasn't any additional evidence with respect to whether the windows were repairable. And we dispute that. We'll present evidence that it is not feasible to repair these windows, which is the standard set forth in the guidelines. The second part is we'll discuss the proposed ILT windows and discuss why we believe they conform to the guidelines and are specifically designed by Pella as replacement matches for historic and traditional designs. Now, I don't know the procedure, but certainly it seems like it would be within council's purview if it determines that based upon our presentation that it is not feasible to repair the windows, to make that finding and send the case back to ARB for determination as to whether the ILT windows comply with the guidelines. But that will be a question for council to discuss. So the first step is, are these repairable? We submit they aren't. As said through here, the windows are very old. If they are original, we don't know, but if they are, they're nearly 70 years old, and they need to be replaced. Why do we believe they need to be replaced? Well, the owners contacted 16 different window companies and contractors to come and review. Many didn't respond, and the ones who did all advised replacement, that it was infeasible to repair. This is a list of the companies that were contacted, many of whom have done a good bit of work here in the city area. Chris Thompson is here of Pella Windows, and I proffer to you that he's opined in his review of the windows that it's not feasible. It's economically infeasible to repair and restore the current windows and to an acceptable quality performance when compared to replacing the windows. The design review guidelines maintain that if the windows should be retained or restored, that they should be retained or restored if possible. What does that mean? Well, if we look at other parts of the design review guidelines, Chapter 9, which is rehabilitation, talks about feasibility, reasonableness. The relocation section, ARB needs to consider the economic feasibility of restoring the window. Demolition, same issue, and same issue with the raising, demolition, and moving criteria in the appendix, the economic feasibility of restoring the building. So, it seems that the guidelines are pretty clear on guiding us how to review projects and how to analyze whether it is possible to repair or replace, because the standard is feasible. The ARB recently, just a couple months ago, approved replacement windows on the request of an owner, and the ARB asked the owner, could they be repaired? And the owner said, no, they were old, rotting, and it was not feasible to repair them. That request was approved. And that supports our position that if the windows are not feasible to be repaired or restored, then they should be replaced. That brings us to the second issue of whether these particular windows are proper to be installed as replacement windows in the AP2 district. ARB never got to this issue, but we believe that they are compatible. And we have a couple examples in the back of these of the room here of those ILT windows. So along this block, there are a number of different types of windows. There's windows with buttons, without. There are SDL windows. There's non-conforming windows that had been in place prior to the guidelines. And as you can see, the panes that are here, I submit that if we don't know whether these are original windows, which is what's required, copies of the originals, I would submit if we don't know they're originals, then what we have to do is say the guidelines would require the owners to put in windows that are acceptable in the AP2 district. They don't have to be exact matches of those windows. This is a picture, we've got the 3D version back here, but it is, as you can see, it has wood muttons on the inside and outside. There are spacers in between to give the appearance of a TDL window with the lights that come through, the shadowing that comes through the window panes to match the existing TDL windows. Pella specifically engineered these to be different than the SDL windows and to give the characteristics of the true divided light window. Here's the window. I cropped and put in a photo of the current house window and the existing window. And if installed, the Pella window will match everything that's existing with that window that's in there now. Have the same size of sash frames, the proportion of the panes will be the same, all the things that are required under the design review guidelines. This is a photo of one type of SDL window. And it is, certainly you can have different types of the SDL window, and certainly the Pella is, because it is not true, it is a form of an SDL window, but the aesthetics and the quality of the Pella ILT are far superior to the SDL. Nothing in the design review guidelines require muttons, don't require single pane glass, don't require TDL windows. What is required is that if we replace them, they have to match the original. We have an issue with that. What we would submit is that these windows are the perfect match for this old home. And although the ARB did not make a decision on it, they did not reject consideration of an ILT as a suitable replacement window in the AP2 district. And as you know, these are the windows that are permitted in the AP2. And what we proposed is, I know it's Pella marketing materials, but when you want to be authentic to your home's traditional or historic design, these are the types of windows you want to have. So in conclusion, I've talked a lot about the guidelines. They are guidelines. They're to guide us in making these decisions. And the windows contribute to, the guidelines say the windows contribute to the facade of the building, the pattern, the openings, proportions, and all those factors that are contained in there. And I submit that the ILT windows meet every one of those markers. And to the mayor's point, we're not here to challenge the guidelines. We're not here to say the guidelines aren't admissible or enforceable in this particular instance. What we're submitting is that all this is within the discretion of the ARB and the council. So first, we believe it is infeasible to repair or restore the windows. That's the standard, and I believe we provided evidence of that. Second, we submit that the windows are compatible with the AP2 district. They're designed specifically for historic and traditional neighborhoods, and they're a significant upgrade in quality, safety of materials, and energy efficiency. So I appreciate and thank you for your time, but what we request is first that the council could find that it is infeasible to repair the windows, which would be and arguably, we did introduce more information on this issue than what was presented at the ARB. And then second, council could either approve the ILT Pella windows replacement or send the case back to ARB because it never had the opportunity to review whether these Pella windows were suitable replacements for this home in the AP2 district. I'm available if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tarley. We may come back to you after the public hearing. Anybody else who'd like to address council, we encourage you to come forward one at a time if there's more than one. Again, if you could provide your name and address and keep your remarks to 5 minutes, we would appreciate that. Welcome, Mr. Spence.
Yes, sir. Mayor Freiling, members of council. My name is Scott Spence, and I'm the chairman of the Architectural Review Board. And I'm here today representing the Architectural Review Board. And I have a couple of statements that really they're points of clarification that I feel are some disparity between what we were presented with at the ARB and our application and the statements and points that are being made for the appeal. And I'd just like to sort of outline those. In the ARB application, the proposal described is to remove existing windows and replace with Architect Series Reserve. The owner was not present at the ARB meeting, but as was stated, the owner was represented by a Pella window sales technician. There was no explanation as to why the owner wished to remove and replace the wood windows at the ARB meeting. The technician showed us 2 Pella wood windows samples, one in pine, one in mahogany. There was no indication that the existing windows were in poor condition or that they were in need of a repair or replacement. Generally, an applicant would provide photos and written assessments from contractors or other professionals citing the condition of the windows, along with recommendations for repair or replacement. None of this was provided to the ARB. In the appeal to council, the appeal letter states that the owners made extraordinary efforts to restore and retain the existing windows by contacting 15 companies over a period of 4 months with no success. This information was not shared with the ARB. The appeal presentation provides a listing of 16 contractors that were contacted to inspect the condition of the existing windows. This list was not presented to the ARB. The appeal letter states all contractors who visited the home agreed that either it was not feasible to repair or restore the windows, or that the windows could not be repaired or restored and needed to be replaced. Again, this information was not presented to the ARB. The appeal presentation also states there can be no dispute that the windows are not repairable or restorable. Given the fact that we were not presented with any information, it's hard for us to state that that claim is true. The only thing I'll say is if some of this information had been presented to us at the ARB meeting, we probably would have had a different discussion. I'm not saying that the approval or denial would have been changed, but we would have had a different discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Spence.
I'm available for any questions if you have any.
It's possible we'll come back
All
to
right.
you. Would anybody else like to speak on this matter? Last call. Seeing no one come forward, I'll close the public hearing, come back to my colleagues for discussion.
Yeah, just a question, if I could go to staff, Ms. Burke, I guess. So in the guidelines, it says if restoration is not possible, then copies of the original windows matching the existing sash and frame with duplicates in wood following the early form detail. So am I to read that to mean that if they cannot be repaired, then they have to be exactly replicated and put back?
Correct.
All the questions I have. I'm sorry, may I ask one more?
Sure,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Sure. I wasn't quite prepared for you to only
Okay, well,
ask
so
one.
I'll ask another one. Mr. Tarley mentioned another case before ARB that I guess the owner of the residence said that the windows were beyond repair and they were allowed to put in some sort of modern window, and I wasn't quite clear what he says. Can you speak to that at all?
I'm not sure what case he's referring to. I was out on leave for a number of months prior to this case going before ARB, so I'm not sure if it was a case that occurred before I was out. We had a recent case for a home on Richmond Road on a garage that was constructed in 1990 to replace their windows, and the ARB did find in favor of the applicant and approved that request, noting that the windows were not in a historic building and they weren't 50 years old.
That is all my questions for now, sorry.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. So I was wondering how an applicant finds out about the design review guidelines when they want to do an application like this.
Typically, when somebody's in the planning stages, either they or their contractor will contact staff and get information on the design review guidelines. They sometimes will send over their packet ahead of time for staff to review and provide comment back to them.
And as far as Mr. Spence's comments, I noticed too that in the application, it just said replace wood windows. There was nothing about any efforts for repair, but in reading the design guidelines, that is the first choice. So if someone had the guidelines, they would read that and see that that would be the first sort of route to take unless information was provided otherwise.
Correct.
And as far as when an application is denied, is there a time limit when someone can reapply with additional information?
No, they could certainly apply at their earliest convenience.
So as far as taking information on the different companies that have been contacted even before this application, then that could be provided as backup information as well.
Yes, they could present the application with additional information.
Okay, and just to confirm what you were saying, we are to apply the guidelines appropriately with the information that was provided with the application to the ARB.
We're to determine if we feel the ARB properly interpreted and applied the guidelines to the request.
Based on the information they had with the application.
I don't know what else they could base it
Yeah.
on, so yes.
Okay, thank you. I don't have anything else at this time.
A couple questions. So just trying to connect the dots with all the information you gave us. We see two law firms represented. What happened to the Kaufman and Knowles?
Staff received a letter stating that they were no longer representing the applicant.
Okay. In terms of the staff memo, it says the city council may affirm, reverse, or modify the decision of the Architectural Review Board in whole or in part. What would be an example of modifying it in whole or in part?
I'm going to defer to Chris on that.
Well, so as an example, you could uphold the decision of the ARB with respect to the replacement issue and send it back to the ARB for further review regarding the windows, since it appears that's not something that the ARB discussed.
Okay, thank you. In one of the other documents prepared by staff, it says the windows were in good condition. How did we determine whether they were in good condition or not? Because we've heard from the applicant that there's rotten wood, so how do we know which is which?
So when staff receives an application for the Architectural Review Board, we're required to post the property. And typically, when I post the property, I take a look at what the applicant is proposing to do, whether it's a new door or a porch or something like that, just to familiarize myself with the property. At this, for this particular application, I took the photographs that were provided in your package and took the time to kind of touch a few of the windows. Some of them had exposed wood at the joinery, and typically that's where you'll see rot present itself first. And they felt very solid to me.
Now, one of the pictures that shows the two casement windows with the paint flaking off, we can assume that that's lead paint?
I don't know.
So we don't really know. If we don't assume it's lead paint, we don't assume that these are original windows. Is that correct?
They could certainly have been scraped and repainted at some point in the past. Staff does not know if it was done.
Okay. Now, the guidelines do allow storm windows. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the storm windows can be aluminum?
Yes.
And in this case, are they aluminum?
I believe so.
So looking at some of these pictures where they do have storm windows, it's really hard to even see whether there are any muttons on the window. Would you agree with that? In terms of the reflection off the storm window?
I mean, that's possible with a reflection, yes.
Yeah. That's all I have right now.
So, Ms. Burke, the applicant or a contractor would normally come to the planning office and seek information on the guidelines and what the process is and get an early opinion from staff about what they might need to do or how they would approach the situation?
Either in person or over the phone, yes, typically.
At that point, would they specifically be told, Ms. Ramsey mentioned that it's in the guidelines. If they had raised the question about replacement, would they be told what the threshold necessary to achieve in proof of the need for replacement was?
Yes, sir.
Did that happen in this case?
So I was out on leave for a prolonged period before this case, and so this case was kind of in the works when I returned from leave. But my understanding, according to the planning director, was that some conversations about window replacement had been had.
Okay. Mr. Spence, may I ask you a question? I just want to make sure I understood you correctly. Did you state that the applicant was not present during the original ARB hearing?
That's correct.
And you had the contractor, the window contractor was the representative?
That's correct.
And there were no photos provided of the existing windows?
We had one photo that I think Ms. Burke had taken as part of her presentation to us.
But none provided by the applicant?
None, no.
And there was no explanation to the ARB about why the windows needed to be replaced?
None.
Okay, thank you, sir.
If I could, I think Mr. Zhang was in a council meeting here while that meeting was going on, so it wasn't, I don't want it to be implied that he didn't show interest in not
I'm
being.
not implying anything, I just want to make sure I understood what he said.
Just want to make sure that it isn't.
Yeah. Mr. Tarley, may I ask you a question?
Sir, Mr. Mayor.
Could you tell us specifically what it is about the condition of the windows that makes it not feasible to repair them?
You're asking a non-contractor, and I will do my best.
Okay.
Okay, so you do have certain rotten wood on those windows, and I think it's actually supported by staff's representation in the minutes, that some need painting and putty, some are in worse repair. I take that to mean that some of them are more difficult to repair than others. So if contractors don't want to come out, or they do come out, and they say that it's not feasible to fix them, it's economically infeasible, it's with the quality that you're going to get and the cost of it, just like in all the other parts of the guidelines, then the decision should be to replace. Specifically, I think each of those windows will probably be in a different condition than the others. Some will be in better shape than the others, but certainly it should be, you've got some of the windows facing the road, some not, that they all should be replaced at the same time.
And do you know if the contractors that were contacted, the 15 or so on the list, if they were replacement window companies or if they were restoration companies?
Some of them were restoration, some of them were repair.
And do you know, was that list passed on, to your knowledge?
Not till, we made the presentation, no. And I think, to be fair, I have no doubt, what the process is, and I would assume that it was taken for granted, for lack of a better term, that the condition of the windows was evident that they needed to be replaced, and Mr. Zhang couldn't be at the hearing. And the appellate representative certainly wouldn't be familiar with the requirements of the design review guidelines. Having said that, it was, notwithstanding, and I believe Ms. Burke is correct, that she wasn't at that particular hearing in which but it was the Hornsby House, that all he represented to the ARB was it wasn't feasible.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tarly.
But if I could just follow up on
And I have
that.
one question, too. Go ahead.
So did they have to, in that ruling, do you recall or do you know if they were required to replace with exact replicas of the windows that are in place, or were they allowed to do some other more modern window?
According to the minutes, they did not replace with the same windows. They replaced with windows that didn't have muttons in it, and the originals did.
And my question is, of the contractors that were contacted, did any of them provide a written statement as far as that they didn't consider the windows to be repairable, or include a type of report or a checklist of number of rotten windows, or is there any supporting documents to that list of contractors?
None obviously were provided to ARB, as been indicated, and and many of them, because of the number of windows, were not interested in doing that many to repair. There's an economies of scale for them as well. I have the appellate rep is here, and I proffered to counsel what he opined. That's the extent of what we have from that perspective.
Well, what I was saying is, so did a contractor come out and take a look at the house and say, oh, maybe one or two might need to be replaced, but I don't want to deal with it? Or did they look at them and say, this window has a certain amount of rot to it, this one just needs put in? Was there a report provided from those contractors to substantiate that they couldn't be repaired?
None were requested for the ARB meeting.
Or even for now?
For now, I think we provided more than evidence than the ARB requires, and I have an appellate representative who's been to that house and would opine that it's better to replace them than to repair.
Because he's selling the windows.
And the person who comes to repair them is selling repair.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Follow up from Ms. Burke.
Can Mr. Tarly sit down?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Tarly.
It's fair to say that you didn't show up with a ladder and check out all the windows. You only looked up on the first floor.
Yes.
Okay, any other questions from anybody? Discussion?
So I think the first thing that comes to mind, and based on the conversation, listening to Mr. Tarly and Mr. Spence, that there may be an opportunity to go back to ARB and provide additional information to ask for a reevaluation of this whole application, just because of, whether, I think, understanding whether windows need to be repaired or not, I think that's a question that needs to be had, certainly one that needs to be answered. So I would support doing that before moving on to an absolute denial of the appeal. But it just is related to this. I know that last Monday we talked, Ms. Murphy gave a presentation on ARB and the guidelines, and I think this is exactly one of the things that we need to be talking about. These guidelines are, it's time to review them. It's time to review the materials that we put in some of these houses. And to me, this type of house would be an ideal candidate for a more modern window, given the structure. It's not a historic building. It's not something that's on the historic registry. I think we ought to move forward to accommodate more modern material. So my position would be maybe send it back to ARB, but happy to hear everybody else.
Well, and as I understand it, the applicant can make a new request to the ARB for reconsideration of this project. So as I understand it, we can uphold the ARB's denial on this application, and then the applicant can make a subsequent application with additional information for the ARB to review at a future meeting. Is that correct?
Does a certain amount of time have to lapse?
This is not a rezoning, this is not an SUP, so no.
So that, because for me, based on the guidelines, the information, and the application that were provided with it, I feel that the ARB made a decision appropriate to the design guidelines, and that if the applicant had perhaps submitted information that we have been provided now, as Mr. Spence said, that they might have considered it differently. So by allowing the applicant to go back with another request, then it can be taken with that information in hand.
My recommendation is to refer it back to the ARB for two reasons. One is to actually get definitive opinion as to what the condition of all the windows are, because we've got some statements saying they're in good condition and other statements saying that they're rotted and need more than just paint and putty. And then the second reason would be so that ARB could actually determine whether the ILT window is a suitable replacement.
Yeah, I think both Mr. Spence and Mr. Tarley agreed that the information that was presented today is different than what was presented originally at the ARB meeting. As Mr. Spence said, they would have had a different conversation at the ARB if they'd had that information. So I would support my colleagues in suggesting that it go back to the ARB, because we need at least 3 people to vote for something in order for this to move forward. So is that an appropriate?
I think that's fine. I think your motion would be to postpone the matter and refer it back to the ARB for further consideration with the additional information for the ARB to consider.
Mr. Mayor, I would move to postpone a decision on this and refer this back to the ARB, where additional information could be presented to the Architectural Review Board for consideration.
That was very cleverly stated.
Yeah. Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Freiling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang? Abstain.
Okay, that concludes our public hearings for today. That brings us to reports. Give just a moment for folks to reorganize here. The first report's monthly financial statement. Mr. Trivette, anything you'd like to highlight to council?
We were reporting earlier this week that we were a little behind in our posting of collected revenues. I think we have caught up to where we typically are at this point in the year, so that's been resolved. Just wanted to know that. And we won't go deep into the financial report today, just because we're going to have a fairly comprehensive discussion of the city's financial position over the past year a little later in the agenda.
Okay, any questions from Mr. Trivette? No. Monthly departmental operating report, sir?
Submitted for your review.
Questions?
No.
City manager report.
Today, during the city manager's report, I was going to ask Leanne Hartman to come forward and talk to you. I was looking for you, Leanne. I got worried that you had stepped out. I asked her to come forward and talk to us about an issue you had brought up, I believe, a few months ago regarding the possible renaming of the community building. So, Ms. Hartman?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Freiling, City Council. After researching other city and county procedures for the naming and renaming of city and county facilities, we recommend the following procedure for renaming the city's community building. The city manager will establish a working committee composed of 2 city council members, 2 city staff members, and 2 community members. The committee will implement a public awareness campaign and solicit names for the community building from the general public. Upon conclusion of the public input, the committee will then review the names and select 5 to 6 from the pool. The committee will then offer those names to be voted on by the public. Upon conclusion of the voting period, the winning name will be announced by City Council. The proposed timeline is as follows. The city manager will establish the working committee by the end of December. The awareness campaign and solicitation of names from the public will take place in January. The committee will review the submissions and select 5 to 6 from the pool in February. The public voting period will take place in March, and the city council will name the new name of the building in April of 2020. For your consideration.
Questions for Ms. Hartman?
No, I think, not a question, but just a comment. I think this is something that council's been talking about for years, identifying this building as something with a little bit more panache than a community building. I think just in terms of branding for marketing purposes, for weddings and that type of thing, to have it known as the Freiling Center or something.
Or the Ramsey Pond Center.
Something renowned would be better. So I applaud your efforts to get this done and look forward to hearing what comes forward from the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Hartman, for your presentation. Remind me, because I can't help but think back to the Parks and Rec episode, for those who've watched it, where they try to rename a whole park, and they've got slews and slews of nicknames and names that people try to proffer, some jokingly and some very tacky. So how are you going to regulate the process so that,
And that's why we have some oversight through that review committee that the manager is going to set up. We wanted this to be a public event, something that we're going to receive that information from the public, but we wanted some oversight on it. We didn't want a Bodie McBoatface, as Great Britain will tell you all about. We feel that by soliciting the names from the public, letting the committee review it, and then put 5 to 6 names out, we think would be appropriate.
it's obviously anonymous when you can submit a name, right? Or do you have to attach
Anonymous,
a name?
well, we would certainly prefer that you put your name on it, because if you win, we'd like to be able to let people know.
Right. Thank you.
And I would just like to add my thanks for the process. I think it's important to have it named a little more appropriately than the community building, particularly as we develop that city square with additional activities. And I think it's also important to have the community involved with the process. So thanks.
Just one question. What's our mechanism for going out and getting the survey?
I have drafted up some procedures and some guidelines for the committee to take a look at, kind of a jumping off point for them to take a look at, whether they want to name it after people, places, things, whatever. Those guidelines and procedures would be established by the committee, and then do their public awareness campaign and solicitation of names.
But what about the voting? How does that mechanism work? Is Mark going to do that?
We'll probably use the city's message board, public input on the city's webpage, and other means by which people can vote. That, again, would be up to the committee to decide how they want to receive voting.
We pay for a software that we've used many times now for surveys and input and a whole host of things involving public comment. And it's called publicinput.com. It folds right into our website, and that'll be the vehicle.
Thank you.
I don't want to get too much into the specifics, and I know the committee will do some good work here. Is there a way when people register their opinion or vote or offer a suggestion that it's tied to something like an email address so that we don't have people voting inappropriately?
Sure. Yeah, we can control all of that. We had, Ms. Hartman has contemplated an award process too for the top vote getters, and then obviously the winner in the end of the process. So we do want to collect some information from the people who submit the names so that we can reward them.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
I think we all think it's a great idea.
Yes.
Is that all you need from us?
That's all I need.
We'll look forward to hearing more about it, and if any of my colleagues have an interest in serving on this committee, perhaps you could speak to me separately. Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Trivette?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, this takes us to unfinished business. The first item today is the consideration and adoption of Ordinance 19-25, amending Chapter 11 of the City Code to include regulations for micromobility devices and shared micromobility devices. Mr. Trivette?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We're going to hopefully conclude our discussion today regarding how to regulate micromobility in the city. As you all know, we have already presented on this once. We showed you what some of our collected data is, and then rolled out what our recommendation would be for moving this forward. And I'm just going to briefly go through some of that information again today, and then get to the punchline, which is our continued recommendations and finalized pilot program guidelines. So personal use obviously is a component of this because as these vehicles get less and less expensive, we're going to see more and more of them in private ownership. Much of what we're going to talk about today focuses on the shared use platforms. But it is important to understand that our proposed regulations will impact personal use also, and we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. As I said, shared use is the focus, and the reason that it is because last year's General Assembly session produced a Senate bill or a House bill that actually allowed localities to regulate these types of platforms and actually incentivized our doing so before January the 1st. As you all remember, if the city takes no action before January the 1st, then the regulation of these types of platforms will default to state code, which would allow them to just come into the community and deploy without oversight, which we think would be a mistake for Williamsburg. So that was what led us to the point of considering regulation. So as you remember, when we presented last month, we showed you that we had gone out and collected comparative data from localities across the state and across the nation that have already stepped into this regulation, either in a permit system, a vendor-based licensure system, or an open system, and even some banning. In the end, what we did was we extracted from that information sort of the best practices that we could gain, and they're represented here by these 6 kind of key tenets: safety, speed, data collection, parking, where they can be used, and who has liability if an injury occurs. So from that, we moved forward to our recommendation, and that recommendation was that the city use an RFP program to select one vendor who will be our vendor for the duration of a 3-year pilot program. The 3-year pilot program gives us ample time to evaluate the effectiveness of our regulation and also our partnership with the vendor, so that during that 3-year period, we can make alterations to the program before deciding whether or not we want to make it a permanent feature of city code or discontinue it. Also, the pilot program, it allows the city to terminate the program with 30 days notice to the vendor and the vendor to do the same to the city. So on either side, if it's not working during that 3-year period, it only takes 30 days notice to discontinue it. So the key elements of what we're presenting today are represented here in 12 sort of key tenets. First is safety. You'll notice if you look at the outlined program, which will be the second item on our agenda today, the actual resolution, the vendor will be required to provide 4 rider academies each year. We're going to try to time those, of course, with the students' arrival at both semesters, and then 2 other opportunities during the year as well to refresh those people who are using these on the correct way to use them, both from the standpoint of the city as well as the vendor. Next is parking, and we talked about this pretty extensively in our presentation last month. We're going to do a hybrid system that allows for both docking stations that are solar charging locations in the more restricted zones of downtown. We will allow for corrals in certain areas of the city where you can only park in that zone, but there won't be a charging component. And then there will be some areas where you can park in a traditional dockless system. Because obviously the success of these programs is based on your being able to use it as your schedule demands. And so if it's too restrictive, then it sort of defeats the purpose of the program. The third item is speed and time. And so speed will be restricted to 15 miles an hour in the city, regardless of the speed limit on the street, which is typically 25 or greater. And then the time restriction we proposed is between midnight and 7 a.m. Original drafts of our pilot program had a much longer restriction during nighttime hours. And in discussions with William and Mary, who we want to partner with on this so that we can have one consistent vendor across both our jurisdictions, they suggested that we considered extending the hours because students are going to use these as a safer alternative to walking late at night. And so it was sort of coincidental at the time that we were putting together the actual pilot program document. The same day, the University of Virginia produced their monthly magazine, and a feature in that magazine was on their scooter program on campus. And some of the students interviewed said that it was actually a safer alternative for late night travel to and from the library. So we decided to revise that to follow the William and Mary recommendation of midnight. Locations, we have restricted the use pursuant to the desire of Colonial Williamsburg, and of course our best practice would be that these items be restricted in the historic area completely, meaning that you cannot be on the sidewalks at all in the historic area, and we'll show you the map of that boundary in a few minutes.
Not just the sidewalks, but also the streets.
So the streets, I mean, the distinction that we're making here is that the historic area is bigger than Duke of Gloucester Street. So the restriction for the streets only applies to those places where you can't have vehicular traffic now. We're going to show you a map that further clarifies that. The data provision is still there, and that is that the vendor has to supply us with everything that they collect, and if we find that we need data that's not being collected, they will work with us to try and identify a way to do that. And then, of course, liability, there will be waivers required as the rider initiates the ride. That waives us of the liability that we're able to waive. So we're protecting us as best we can. Fees, this is an important piece because one of the things that every locality has done is include fees for both the administration of the program, further enforcement efforts as the program continues, and then building a cache of money that can be used to improve the facilities that allow these units to be used safely in the city. So bike lanes and that type of infrastructure. In our case, we're proposing a $5,000 annual fee that will go toward the administration of the program, a per unit fee of $50 per year, and then a per ride fee of 50 cents. Initially, I was concerned that these numbers were a little bit too high, but in comparison to other communities with similar restrictions on the number of units and universities, this is consistent. So I think this is a good starting point. You'll notice that in the pilot program language, there are a number of opportunities where it says the city manager has the ability to make changes to this as we negotiate, and that's just to give us the ability to adjust if we find that this is too restrictive or not restrictive enough. Affordability, we think it's important that there be some affordability program built into this. So as we go through the negotiations with a vendor, we'll be looking at ways to provide an affordable low-income membership program. And that continues to evolve as communities do that. And so we'll be looking at best practices again as we conclude the RFP process. Number 9 is support, and that's really just sort of a general statement that the vendor that's selected is more than just a contractor, it's a partner in this, and the success of the program depends upon the two of us working together toward the common end. Number 10 is numbers. We talked about where to start and the industry standard, and that's sort of what we use to base this off of. So it's 150 units with a dynamic cap so that it can be adjusted up or down based on observed program performance. Particularly as we look at rides per day on each unit. That'll be the test. So we'll look at that consistently throughout the program. And of course, that will also change based on William & Mary's participation. So if we notice that we are experiencing a shortage of units because there are a lot on campus being used and there are not enough in other places, then we may increase the cap or have strategic deployment of increased numbers. This gives us the best amount of flexibility. Number 11 is again the partnership issue that we talked about, and one of the expectations is that the vendor will have a facility within the greater Williamsburg area where they have on-hand staff to respond to complaints and concerns. You'll notice that in the pilot program, we are really trying to guard against as best we can the clutter that is the biggest complaint that you receive from these types of programs across the community that has them. And so we're being fairly restrictive in that the vendor has an hour to respond to those complaints, collect the device, and if they don't do so, the city can collect it, and then the vendor has to pay a fee to have it returned. And what we found in our review of other programs was that when cities enacted that final piece of what I just said, that fee to return the vehicle, the vendors became much more proactive in making sure that clutter didn't happen. And that was one of the comments that we got as I talked to some of the planning directors that have implemented these programs in communities in the region. And then finally is duration. As I said, this is going to be a 3-year program with the ability to terminate with 30 days notice by either party. So we wanted to highlight just for a few minutes a couple of the points that were brought up during our meeting last month that needed further review. And one of those topics was sidewalks and where these units can be used on the sidewalk. Should they be used on the sidewalk at all? And I think the key to that is a discussion of what our existing bike and pedestrian facilities look like. So I asked Celia Gordon, our GIS technician, to come today to show you a product that she's been working on that sort of tells that story in a digital way.
Okay. Mayor Freiling and members of council, I've been tasked today to answer 2 questions. Where do we have bike lanes in the city? And number 2, where do we not have bike lanes in the city? They seem like very similar questions, but one has some pretty black and white, and the other has some very gray areas. So first off, we're only as good as our data, so I'll talk a little bit about where I got our data. So it came from 2 different places. One is from the state, from VDOT. So we have state level data, and then we have local data. Okay, and within this data, there's designations of a designated bikeway, a shared roadway. And so the VDOT data, it's very clear. A lot of it has been in place since as early as 1978, when they started with some of these bike routes. And then the local data, I gathered that from the Historic Triangle Bicycle Advisory Commission. And so I asked someone who was on that committee for information, what is a shared roadway? And I asked that because I said, if I'm on a scooter or on a bike and I'm on the road, aren't I automatically sharing that road? And that was kind of a naive question because, as you can see here, this was the answer. So a shared roadway is one that has shoulders wide enough to accommodate a cyclist, but does not have a minimum 5-foot demarcated bike lanes per VDOT standards. In contrast, roads having no shoulders would not be designated as a shared roadway. Okay. So now you could see here the blue lines are the existing bike lanes, the pink lines are the multi-use paths, the green lines are shared roadways, and then the orange dash lines are proposed. And I also have the city boundary on there. And then also the purple, which they're appearing a little blue here, but the parkway is in purple, and those are maintained by the Park Service. So first off, I'm gonna take off the proposed, just so we can see what we're working with today. And then I'm gonna go ahead and click on and off the shared roadways. And so we could start to see where these gaps are. And I'm removing the shared roadways because we'll see how this is kind of the gray area. These are the areas where one person might interpret that they feel comfortable biking there, but perhaps another person would not. But it's also important to note that the term shared roadway was included in that VDOT in 1978. So it's not a new term. It's not a term that was established only by the HBATC. So that committee was part of the first regional bike plan, which is from the 90s. So the terminology has stayed pretty consistent. Okay, so as we can see, we start getting gaps when we remove those green lines. Okay, just to drive home for clarity, we're gonna look at what does a designated bike lane look like. So we can start something we might all be familiar with. see very, very clearly marked on Jamestown Road. You can see both sides, there's bike lanes here. Then we'll take a look. Richmond Road, both sides of the street, very clear. Also, you can take a look, this one's a little newer. Take a look at 2nd Street, very clear, white lines, very clear where you're supposed to be. So now that we've drilled that home, we know what a designated bike lane looks like. We can now look at a shared roadway and see where this becomes a gray area. So as I just mentioned, we saw Jamestown Road, we saw Richmond Road. Those appeared to be a perfect place to bike. There's certain areas within Jamestown Road where it introduces this gray area with a double turn lane, turning this way, and from the other side, turning this way. We lose the bike lane for that small section. And we also have to consider on Jamestown Road, going from the business school toward Merchant Square, there's potentially cars parked. So depending what day it is, if it's the weekend or not the weekend, there's also cars there, which could potentially bring people in the bike lane closer to the road. I'm also going to point out, this is England Street, but I want to point out Francis Street. So within this intersection, Francis Street is one of the only streets highlighted as a shared roadway. So different parts of it, you know, you have to use your own discretion to determine if you would feel safe biking there. So those are two different parts. And then finally, I will also show South England Street and then down Newport Street. So I circled this here because this is a sign showing when you can park or when you're not able to park. So this is another situation where if there was a car parked there, that would bring someone cycling closer into the street. Then I'll just gloss over some of the multi-use paths just because I think everyone has a clear picture of what those look like because they're very, very clear, very separate. So it's Battery Boulevard, Quarter Path, completely separate, and then just a swath of ironbound there. So completely separate, completely off the road. Then I'll go ahead and show a couple that weren't designated as anything, and that will come into play when we talk about sidewalk restricted areas. So this is a part of Prince George where it meets Armistead, and as you can see, pending traffic, it could be okay, it might not be. Different areas downtown and in the historic area, it's also a point of discretion. I've got Boundary right before Newport with the amount of traffic would probably be perfectly fine. Finally, I'm going to end with an example of a route that I chose based on a demographic that might be interested in taking a scooter. So I started on Carey Street. So I'm going to start by showing you're going down Carey Street. That's what it looks like. As you turn onto Jamestown Road, as we talked about, you know, pretty clear cut. As we continue down Jamestown Road, once we get into this turn lane, it starts to get a little bit tricky. If you're going down the lane, you might be in between two cars pending traffic. If people are turning right, you're going to try to stay in the bike lane. Finally, when you're making that loop onto Richmond Road, that's what it's going to look like. We lose the designated bike lane in Richmond Road, and part of this is because there's share rows there. And what the share rows are, it's just the picture of the bike with the two carrots on top. And what that means is in the travel lane, if there was a bike there, that's the preferred route for the bike, but it's not necessarily a bike lane. So we're making our way to High Street. This is Harrison Avenue. We're back to that very clear bike path. Then as we continue on, we get into a bit of a messier area. Once the turn lane is in the center, there's no bike lane there. It's not necessarily clear where a biker or scooter would be. Becomes even less clear when a right turn lane onto where Lafayette and Monticello meet is introduced. That becomes less and less clear where you should be. And then this is once you've crossed Monticello, there's absolutely no bike lane there. And then a similar situation with the turners. Again, we've got 2 lanes here that are going straight, and then a right turn lane with bypass. And that can become difficult depending if the scooter or the bike is deciding to, stay straight and go in between cars. And then finally, we've got people merging back onto bypass. So again, you might be in between 2 cars, but then you're almost there. And as you approach, this is a sign for High Street, and then you make the decision if you're going to continue to act as a scooter or a bike or act as a car and turn left, or if you're gonna defer to the sidewalk, wait for the light to change, and then take the crosswalk. So hopefully that has highlighted some of the gray area of the bicycle routes and will help your decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Go back to the PowerPoint. Thank you, Thela. So that shows you sort of the dichotomy of the differences between bike lanes and not bike lanes, and it's not always clear. So what we've done in the pilot program and in the ordinance before you today is we've said that scooters and e-bikes can be operated on sidewalks where roads do not have marked bike lanes. So hopefully that makes it as clear as it can be. And you can see that it's not as simple as, well, okay, Jamestown Road, they'll be in the bike lane, because there are portions of Jamestown Road where they will be in the bike lane and portions where they won't be. The intent of what we've written, and I have to thank Ms. Shelton for putting together the pilot program and the ordinance, is to keep scooters and e-bikes out of areas that have very heavy pedestrian traffic. So sidewalks along Jamestown where we have bike lanes, obviously that's heavy pedestrian areas. Downtown and in the historic area, heavy pedestrian areas, and that's the purpose of the restriction. So this map shows you where we are prohibiting sidewalk use, regardless of whether there's bike lanes or not, and that's basically downtown and the first part of the historic area. And I didn't do a map because I thought it was fairly self-explanatory of where they are restricted completely, meaning street and sidewalk, and those are the streets in the historic area where vehicular traffic's not allowed. Now, the important thing to note there is that would include personal use, not just the shared systems. So this will prohibit electric bikes and scooters on Duke of Gloucester Street and the associated streets. You would have crossover on those streets that have vehicular traffic, though. So it wouldn't be a site that you wouldn't see at all, because it will exist.
Personal use meaning private use?
That's right. If you privately own a scooter, it will still not be allowed on streets that don't allow motor vehicle traffic.
But within that area, motor vehicle traffic is allowed. So if you were going to, say, Bruton Parish Church by vehicle, you could also go by e-scooter?
No. If the street is generally closed to motor vehicle traffic, you couldn't use a scooter there. But you could get as close as you can and park the scooter. But you'd be using the street, not the sidewalk. And to help with that...
Let me just clarify. Are you saying that the geofencing is not timed, it's 24 hours a day?
That's right.
So that if the area is restricted at any point, it's restricted all the time?
That's right.
And they don't have the capability to open it up at night or for church services?
Right.
That doesn't include personal owned scooters, because
They don't have geofence capability.
geofencing.
That's right. And that's why we're not restricting it. If the street is generally closed to motor vehicle traffic, these uses are not allowed.
But a personal one would work in that area. We would just have to, I guess,
get on your scooter
hope
and
that
arrest
they
them.
would understand based on signage that is put up there that e-scooters are not allowed in these areas.
That's right. And so the enforcement will fall to the police department and Colonial Williamsburg Security. Now, we recognize and want people to be able to pick up a scooter at their hotel, wherever it might be in the city, and make their way to the historic area. I mean, the point of this is to make transportation easier, not harder. And that's why we're going to require the vendor to do the docked charging solar stations in these critical areas. So one way to think about that is if I'm in a hotel on Richmond Road and I want to pick up a scooter and ride to Merchant Square, in those parking lots, there will be space for that solar charging station where you'd have to dock it. And what we're saying in the pilot program and with the vendors as we do the RFP process is that their geofencing capability has to have the ability to not allow a user to end their ride in those areas unless they are parked in one of those spots. And so that's an exciting sort of emerging piece of the technology is that this all gets better, that they'll be able to do that. And so that will eliminate the concern of a bunch of scooters just sort of haphazardly parked in parking lots because of the restriction on Duke of Gloucester Street.
And when there's no space in the docking station.
Right.
Right. I don't have an answer to that, Mayor. I mean, I don't know that there is an answer. When there's no space in the docking station, then you'll have to find another spot to park it that is outside of the zone where that docking station is required.
By in the ride means that the meter,
That's right.
their bill will continue to be charged so long as it's not in that appropriate place.
That's right. It's like riding in a taxi where the driver won't let you out until he's exactly where he needs to be. So with that, we still have the same timeline that we rolled out at the last meeting. December, present the recommendations. In February, we will issue the RFP. And then in March, we will take the responses from the vendors and then expect devices to be deployed in May. We'll take any questions.
First question, and before I turn it over to colleagues, have we done the presentation for both A and B now?
I think we could take them
Yes.
both together if you
Right,
want.
I just want to make sure there wasn't another.
It's two
anything
separate
else.
action items, is
Right,
why I
okay.
split it out.
'Cause-
So just a quick question. I would assume the college will be looking for a vendor, charging a fee to that vendor, and they'll have the same type of discussions on campus so that there's some revenue sharing for them as well, independent of ours.
That's possible. I mean, I can't speak for the college, the university, but I think that they desperately want to work with us and have us be the lead. And so what I think will happen is, and they have reviewed the pilot program, provided notes which were incorporated. I think what will happen is we will take the lead in terms of doing the RFP and selecting the vendor. They will probably piggyback on that procurement so that they don't have to go through a similar process, which is allowed in the state of Virginia. And then they will have very similar, if not the same, regulations on campus. One of the things that they have to be more mindful of is that there are buildings that are only accessible by sidewalk. And so they will probably be more lenient on that use in terms of on campus versus what we have. And then, of course, it certainly allows them to negotiate separately with the selected vendor for fees for entrance to the campus. So.
And that makes sense. So and where I was heading with that is, we're talking about allowing 150. Is it conceivable that the college may, with the same vendor, say, we'll allow an additional 100, so then now there's 250 running around the city, or do you think
That's not the intent. Certainly, they are statutorily enabled to do that, but I can tell you that from my conversations with them, that's not their intent either. They want us to be in charge of setting that number, and that's why we've written the pilot program the way that we have, giving me the ability to alter the number based on what we see as the experience, including William & Mary's participation.
and that's excellent, so I appreciate that from our partner like that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Thanks for circling back with our feedback to council so that we can act on, or not act, but I believe we're probably going to act today with some sort of regulation. I wanted to tie my first question back to an observation I had last month, which is the differences in enforcement when it comes to whether you're using or operating the scooter on the road versus operating the scooter on the sidewalk, being that, correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Shelton, if you're on the road, there's an opportunity where you can be charged with operating while intoxicated. But when you're on the sidewalk, you're treated as a pedestrian, so that's what, a drunken public charge? I'm not a prosecutor, so.
Right, well, so I think I've done some additional research on this because that was the off the top of my head answer, and now I'm going to give you the I've done the research answer. I don't think that driving while intoxicated is going to be available at all as a charge, regardless of whether it's operated on the roadway or operated on the sidewalk, because it's not classified in the state code as a motor vehicle, just a vehicle. And when the DUI, the statute that provides for the criminal offense for driving while intoxicated requires you to be operating or driving a motor vehicle. And so it would be a drunken public charge.
So that's different than a motorist.
Right, well, there's vehicles, which are a world of things,
Right.
and there are motor vehicles, which are a smaller
That's
classification of
specifically
things.
defined by the statute. But either way, we want to make sure we have some tight enforcement, and I know that's been mentioned before. And I know you, Mr. Police Chief, will do a great job with that, because even if it's not considered as a motor vehicle, you're having someone operating some sort of motorized vehicle going at some speed and having some potential impact for collision with someone else. We obviously want to avoid that at all costs. But not to make it all doomsday, based on your presentation last month, Mr. Trivette, it seemed that there were not that many incidents regarding this matter from other localities when you were doing the comparisons. But it's a possibility, and I think that's important for folks to realize that possibility. I had a concern from a neighbor or a resident. I guess what her question was if you have a scooter operating on the roadway and then it goes to a sidewalk, she was saying, is there any way, and I guess it'll be hard to enforce this, for that scooter at whatever speed to come to a stop and then right before it transitions to the sidewalk? I'm thinking probably not, because for, bicycles, they're not going to do that. But given that this has some sort of electric motor component to it, I thought it'd just be worth asking that on her behalf.
Obviously, we can include just about anything we want to in terms of rules and regulations. The question is enforcement, and it would be really hard to enforce that. The officer would have to be there and observe that happening.
Right.
But that's not dissimilar from rolling through a stop sign. The officer has to be there to see the violation and then issue the ticket. So I guess I would probably discourage you from going that route, just because the instances in which we'd be able to act on it would be far and few between.
Last question, and you may have touched on this already, but if there's a construction site, particularly in the Midtown area, is there a way to limit that geofencing, preventing folks from, endangering themselves going through that particular site? I'm thinking expansions of crosswalks or having heavy gear. There was also a law classmate of mine who went through a similar program with the Micromobility in Austin, Texas, and some of his friends experienced some injuries as a result of haphazardly operating one of these devices nearby a construction site.
Sure.
But
yes.
that's just kind of my 2 cents there. So.
That's the intent. As we do construction projects all over the city, roads change, lanes are closed, and we'll need the flexibility to be able to restrict these during those times.
Right.
That's not to say that there won't be accidents, because certainly there will be. I think it'd be naive to think that we'll be the only city that doesn't have accidents based on this use. Yeah. I think that they will be fewer than we expect, but those few will certainly be worth talking about, I'm sure.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for the updated information, and as usual, a couple questions. So deployment of the devices, is that something that you and the vendor will work out to be sure that they're sort of spread out all over?
Yes.
And can I just say, once a vendor is selected, we still have to, City Council will still need to execute a license agreement with that vendor. And so this is not the last time you're going to see this, because there's going to be a very specific contract with the vendor that's selected. The contract will be governed by the guidelines.
And to that point, if there are modifications to the contract over the pilot program, is that something that will come back to City Council, or
In many instances, the city manager has the authority to change the pilot program without coming back to city council. But in terms of between now and issuing the license would come back to council. And so if there were changes made to the fees as a result of those negotiations, that's when council would have the opportunity to say, we're comfortable with this or we're not.
And as far as enforcement, what do other localities do to actually enforce infractions with scooters? Or do we know of?
Cops.
There, in every instance of pilot programs and scooters that I found, it was heavily reliant on the police department.
To just say, get off the sidewalk, or are there any
In the other
fines, or-
localities, it was a combination of things. They had the ability to just give warnings, which in most cases was what they were doing, and offer suggestions on correct riding. But in other instances where repeat violations or significant violations, then they issued tickets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I know bicyclists don't do what they're always supposed to do. And as far as William and Mary, so even though there might be just one vendor, there could be two vendors, but any scooters under our program would have access to the campus, and their scooters would have access to the city except for the historic area.
So that's exactly what we're trying to prevent, is there being more than one company and two different sets of rules. Because obviously, I think the college administration and we recognize that if the campus said that they were going to allow scooters and we said that we weren't going to allow scooters, that boundary would be a zone of chaos as people left scooters right on the edge of campus, transitioning to just walking to destinations within the city. So we're going to do our best to avoid that exact outcome.
Well,
Okay,
and even if they chose a second vendor, that second vendor is not authorized to operate off of campus in the city streets, so they
right.
would not be able to take them off campus.
Right. It's our licensure will impact the rest of the city outside of the campus boundary.
Okay? And I think that's it for questions. Thank you.
A couple questions and comments. Going back to areas where we're not allowing the electronic vehicles, what if we have, say, a power-assisted bike that's now going into the historic area and then converts to manual? Is that allowed? So they're not using the electric assist?
Well, no, I mean, there's no way for us to determine whether or not they're using the electric assist. So if they're operating an electric assist vehicle in the historic area, I would say no. That would not be allowed.
In terms of the program, are you anticipating maybe a probation program or formal evaluation several months into it, where we come back and look and see what's working and what's not working?
Not a formal one, no. We're going to be doing that constantly because we want to act as quickly as we can if it turns out to be something that's not working. So no, there's no plan to come back, report to council at intervals. It's just a matter of the staff evaluating the performance, handling the complaints, and if it becomes a situation where it's not working, of course, we'll let you know that we plan to terminate with the 30-day provision.
I'm thinking some of the rules, too. We may want to be reevaluating some of the ground rules.
Sure, we're going to be doing that the whole time. I mean, that's why the pilot program has a provision that allows me to make changes as we see fit.
In terms of the indemnification clause, where we're saying for any claims arising out of operation on streets and sidewalks, don't we want it broader than that? I mean, there are going to be areas where we're going to get sued. It might not be a street or sidewalk.
Well, so the basis of the claim would be that they're operating on a street or sidewalk. This is a private company. This is not the city of Williamsburg that's licensing or operating. We're simply licensing them to operate on city streets and sidewalks. If they're on private property, that's a matter between the company offering the device and the person who's operating it.
Well, I'm thinking maybe it's a parking lot managed by the city or leased by the city that's not a street or a sidewalk, but they could still be suing us.
Okay, well, we'll look at that.
Yeah, okay. And so we talked about the VDOT definition for bike lane being 5 foot. We have bike lanes in the city that aren't 5 foot wide. So, I mean, it gets back to the point where we're saying you have to use a bike path if it's marked. Well, what if it's marked but it's not illegal for VDOT bike path? And what if it's marked and the condition of it's such that it's not safe to be using it? How do we work through those issues?
Those are good questions. The way that the pilot program is written right now, if it's marked, regardless of the dimensions, regardless of its condition, you have to be in the bike lane.
Yeah. What about, and we talk also about the not parking it illegally. What's the protection for the citizens for them being parked on private property that they don't own? So in other words, what if these bikes just get dropped on people's front yards? Where's the provision where that's not allowed?
Well, I think that the provision would be, I think that is allowed. That's the dockless system. But what happens is if it's left there and the neighbor doesn't like it, they make the complaint and the vendor has an hour to pick it up. And that's worked. That's the good thing is you can see programs. I think, I'm trying to remember which ones exactly, but I think Santa Monica's program switched to that very strict type of enforcement where a called-in complaint had to be acted on. I think they gave 3 hours, and the vendor was very compliant with that.
And that number to call would likely be on the unit itself.
Yes.
And then, so the restrictions say in Merchant Square, where we know there's going to be parking areas for them, does that mean they'd have to walk the devices to get to those parking areas in Merchant Square if they're going across to a different parking area? They're allowed in there, but they just can't be riding them?
No, you would be allowed to ride it into the parking lot, say P4, P5, P6, all of those areas because they're open to vehicular traffic.
Okay.
They couldn't be on the sidewalk, but they could be on the street. And then park and walk into the streets that are not open to vehicular traffic.
So one of the advantages of, let's say, an e-scooter or e-bike connecting the two campuses for the College of William and Mary. So how do we connect the main campus to the Plumeria Park area campus? So if we look at that, and I don't know if we've got the details on GIS, but if we're going to go from, say, the education school to Plumeria Park, we've got County Road on Trayburn that changes into City Road. It's 30 miles an hour. So in that case, they'd be forced to use the sidewalk, which is very narrow. Is that one of the areas we could take a look at and say, how do we actually facilitate a safe connector there? Because that would be actually a great way to get students back and forth.
I think the answer is yes, Councilman Maslin. One of the things about this program, and not just our program, but this technology nationwide, is that it is really putting a lot more emphasis on complete street development and a lot more emphasis on multi-use paths and wider lit segments of the city that have that service. So I think that in the future, and I have said this before to the council, as we complete the multi-use path along Monticello, that is going to completely change the expectation of our bike facilities in the city, because now people are going to want that type of facility versus a marked bike lane that shares the street. So I think, yes, as we develop CIPs into the future, bike infrastructure is going to be a major cost.
Thank you.
May I make a suggestion? Could someone look at what streets we have besides Trayburn or on top of Trayburn that have a speed limit of 30? Because that's a speed limit on Trayburn and it has a defined marked bike lane on there. So that's the type of street where I would think that even though it's over the 25, it still might be safe and better for everybody if the scooter was in the bike lane.
Especially with the speed restriction of 15 miles per hour.
So if we could just look at that and see if that's
And it
something-
is important to note that one of the things that Councilman Maslin pointed out was that transition on Trayburn between city and county. So a vendor that wants to be able to allow the student to do that would have to also follow the county's regulations for these devices, which is totally separate from what we're doing today.
And there's also reasonable thought that whatever vendor the city chooses, and if the college chooses, the university chooses the same vendor, that vendor would also be registered in the county, because those are going to be going up Monticello to Newtown as well.
That's the thought.
But one point on your question about the speed limit and allowing the bike there, isn't the state law precluding, if the speed limit is above 25 miles an hour, the state law is precluding the use of that road? So it might be easier to change the speed limit.
I don't want to do that because I think it's too low as it is.
But you can't.
We should talk to our representatives about
Right.
that. At the end of the pilot, do we have the flexibility to decide we don't want scooters and ban them?
Absolutely.
Or do we have the flexibility to say, hey, this has gone really well, we got a great partnership with this vendor, we're just going to continue on with this vendor? And then the third option would be to put it back out for RFP for other vendors.
That's right. We have all of the options available to us at any point during the pilot program.
Aren't we supposed to release another RFP after this? I mean, this is a pilot program versus a.
Yes. The RFP will have a timeline, a contract to it of 3 years with the provision for 30-day termination. And so at the end of that, at the end of the 3 years, if we make it that far with the vendor, we would, if we wanted to continue a scooter program in the same format, we would have to do an RFP again.
Understood.
You, I believe Ms. Ramsey asked the question about the city manager having the discretion to make adjustments, and does that come back to council? You said it wouldn't, but is it safe to assume that if there were material changes to the program, that you would discuss that with council members first?
Absolutely.
One question of something else I'd look at us, whether we'd consider changing, is the time restriction. I know we want to have it compatible with William and Mary because that just makes it easier for everyone. But being out early in the morning, there are a number of people out on the street walking places. Many of them are walking to work. And I know, I can appreciate why we'd want to stop at midnight, because that limits impaired usage up until about 2:30 or 3 o'clock. But once you get to 5 a.m., most people who have been out the night before are home, and the ones who are out are heading out early in the morning. So I think if a little more conversation, maybe that's something that could be looked at as the program goes on, because there's so much less motor vehicle traffic or other motor vehicle traffic out at that point of day that it's almost more safe for the scooters to be operating at that time. And there might be people who really depend on their usage.
I think that's a good suggestion.
Follow-up question. If, recently in Farmville, and there was an independent small business vendor there that rented electric bicycles. Somebody wanted to open a small business here in the city, would we just have to say no because we're only allowing one vendor?
That's right. I mean, that business could apply to be the vendor if the timing were right.
Right.
Otherwise, they would need to wait on us to do the second RFP.
Do I hear a motion?
Back here. I will comment that I'm glad we're doing one vendor, having been to a few cities recently where they have had numerous vendors. It does become very cluttered, and a
It
lot
definitely
of...
speaks to the size.
Well, and I'll add to that, in some of those cities on the West Coast, they've had private clutter collectors. So people make a business out of going to pick up the scooters, and then the scooter company has to pay those private people to...
I think the important thing also is, given that we're the legislative body, we have broad discretion in whether we want to tailor the regulation as we see fit. So to your question, to your earlier point, Mr. Mayor, if for whatever reason we don't like something that's happened where there's an unintended consequence to the policy that we promulgated, we absolutely have the discretion to change that.
Okay, so can I make one motion to include both?
You can.
So I move that City Council adopt ordinances 19-25 and 19-19 as drafted.
19 is a resolution.
Resolution.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Freiling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
That concludes unfinished business, takes us to new business. We have 3 items under new business today. The first is the presentation of comprehensive annual financial report for fiscal year ending June 30, 2019. And with us today, we have Ann Wall of Robinson, Farmer and Cox Associates. Ms. Dameron, will you be kicking this off, or will it be Ms. Wall?
No, actually, Ms. Wall is going to be kicking this off.
Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Ann Wall with the city's auditors, Robinson, Farmer, Cox Associates, and I'm here to present the results of the audit for the year ended June 30th, 2019. Earlier, about a month ago, we met with and reviewed the draft of the audit report with the Finance and Audit Committee. It has now been finalized, and That's the document, I believe, that you have as part of your agenda. We completed the field work in June and in September. As you can imagine, the city's audit is comprehensive and complex, and you can't just get it all done in 1 week. So we are here in the summer and do a lot of our internal control work, and then we come back in the fall and do more of the substantive work, looking at bank reconciliations, accounts receivable detail, payables work, that kind of thing. I'm pleased to report to you that the preparations for the audit by city staff were significant. Staff were available, they were well prepared, they were very professional. The deputy finance director is really our main point of contact during the audit fieldwork process, and she communicated with all departments and allowed us to get in and get our work done and get out. The financial statements themselves required very little adjustment. We did propose a few entries, and they have been posted to the accounting system, so the accounting system mirrors the fund statements that are presented in the city's comprehensive annual financial report. I'm going to review the results of the audit, and there's an auditor's required communication to those charged with governance, which is the city council. We do it in letter form, but I'm just going to review it with you briefly as well. The city engaged us to perform a financial statement audit and a compliance report for the year ended June 30th, 2019. The audit was subject to auditing standards generally accepted in the United States, the audit specifications published by the Auditor of Public Accounts, government auditing standards, the Single Audit Act, and the provisions of a uniform guidance. I say these things just so that you know all those things drive certain aspects of the audit and how we conduct ourselves and certain requirements. The required communication, again, I'm just going to recap a few bullet points from the letter that we issued, but there was one new accounting standard that was adopted this year, GASB 88, certain disclosures related to debt. There's a footnote in the audit report. It really just required additional disclosure. There are accounting estimates in the audit report. There's actually just a whole lot of numbers. There's budget numbers, there's actual numbers, there's audited numbers, there's unaudited numbers, there's statistical data, but there's also estimates. And this communication just really wanted to report to you that there's an allowance for doubtful accounts related to taxes receivable. That's an estimate. The useful lives of capital assets and then how they're eventually depreciated, that's certainly an estimate. And then the pension and OPEB liabilities, their deferred inflows and outflows are estimates that are established by actuaries that are included. We didn't encounter any difficulties or disagreements with management during the course of the audit. And management did make the adjustments that we proposed. We did obtain a representation letter. There's certain elements of the audit report that are prepared in-house, and they're prepared by the finance director, and we work directly with her to get those included in the report. But the management's discussion and analysis, which is just a detailed comparison of this year and last year, that's included, and we only apply certain limited procedures to that. There's a transmittal letter that's included that's prepared in-house, and also the statistical tables, which are in the back of the audit. And we were not engaged to and didn't express an opinion on those. Now on to the results of the audit. I'm pleased to report that we did express an unmodified opinion on each of the following. On the financial statements, that's the first 3 pages of the audit report, it's our opinion. And the top of the second page is where we express the unmodified opinion on the financial statements. And again, that's based on the substantive work that we did during the course of the audit. We also expressed unmodified opinions on internal controls, over financial reporting, and over compliance for each major program, and on internal control compliance for the year ended June 30, 2019. We did not issue a management letter this year. And we certainly review internal controls and discuss those in detail when we're here for the audit. And we do continue to recommend cross-training in the finance department. Again, the challenge there is that the department is not as large as would be allowed for certain cross-training, but again, it's something that they're working on. We did perform an information technology review this year. And conclude that those controls are in place. You certainly have a strong IT department. We have our IT specialist met with the city's IT director and just reviewed the controls that were in place and certainly found those to be just strong, and he had no additional recommendations. There was a restatement this year of beginning balance. I think the finance director will go through that a bit, but the sales tax fund, which is essentially the capital projects fund of the city, was broken out and reported separately. I believe the finance director thought that was more transparent, and I believe I concur with her as well, so that then you can just look at the general fund activity and the capital projects activity is reported in a separate fund. This was also the first year of the tourism fund, so that is included herein. Other reporting requirements, this report also has been filed with the Auditor of Public Accounts with the comparative cost report forms. Those were due by November 30th. The report also has been filed with the Single Audit Clearinghouse, which operates on behalf of the Office of Management and Budget. It's required to be reported and submitted within 30 days after the CAFR was finalized, so that has been done. So really, in summary, the audit is complete. You've met your reporting deadlines. The reports were clean. I know the finance director is going to maybe review some more of the numbers, but I just really wanted to give you the results, our opinions, and the work that we did. If you have any questions for me, I'm here, and I'll stay here through Barbara's presentation as well.
Any questions right now from Ms. Wall? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Dameron?
I'm going to move this because the last time I kept it up here, I put on a show that I don't think we were prepared for. Good afternoon. I'm going to forewarn you, my slide deck has about 22 slides in it, and I do need to spend a fair amount of time on the first couple of slides, but I think after that we'll move at a little bit better pace. As Ms. Wall mentioned, this year we separated the general fund and the capital improvement fund in our comprehensive annual financial report, which I'll refer to as CAFR. And I want to walk through that just a bit. Now, the main reason we did that was for transparency, but also for ease of reporting and management as well. And I have on the slide here 3 columns. The first 2 columns, the first column being the general fund and the second column being the capital improvement fund. That is the fund balance at the end of the year, at June 30th, 2019, as it is presented, separated in the CAFR. The third column is how it would have been presented had we not separated it. So I want you to note, first off, that in the general fund now, we have unrestricted fund balance at $14,280,000. That's about 38.4% of operating revenues. You'll look in the combined column and see, had we combined it, we would have reported unrestricted at the 35% minimum requirement, 35% of operating revenue, which for 2019 was a little over $13 million. Then the assigned balance would have been reported at $14,432,000, and that error there points to the difference between what was reported as assigned in a combined situation as we would have previously reported it, and the $13,158,000 that's shown. Well, actually, it's the difference in our unrestricted. And that would have been, in effect, a transfer from the general fund to the CIP fund that maybe wasn't as transparent as we'd like it to be, to show what amount of funding is required for our projects that's not coming from bonds or grants or the sales tax or interest from that. I'll have you look now at the bottom of the screen. At the end of 2019, we actually had projects appropriated in the amount of $15,188,000 in the capital improvement project. You'll note is when we separated that fund, we have $13,158,000 assigned. That's about a $2 million difference. Now, one of the things that $15 million includes are things that are going to be funded by grants or by bonds. So I have to back that out. And in 2019, we have $530,000 that was going to be funded by bonds, and we have a contribution from William and Mary for funding that we've not received yet, $125,000, and we've not received that because we've not spent that money yet. And then we have projects that are completed that have funds that are available to be used for other projects in the amount of $126,000, and that leaves us remaining $14,406,000 that we need to have funding for. And so that is a gap of $1,248,000 from what I have as assigned versus what we have appropriated for projects. And part of that would have been covered in by that $1,273,000 that normally just kind of transferred over without a transfer because the funds were combined. So in the next slide, I show that what we have is unrestricted at the $280,000 versus the $13 million minimum required per our fund balance policy. We would have had the $1,274,000 that we just talked about. We have to recall, though, that in 2020, in the current year, we reappropriated $179,000 for the schools. So that really reduces the amount of funding that we have available once we make that transfer to about $1.1 million. That leaves about $153,000 that's gap in that funding. And I'll remind you that our fiscal year 20 budget was done with the intent to add $1.2 million to the reserves in the CIP. Now, that may or may not happen because that budget's based on everything gets spent and all of the bond or grants that are appropriated or reimbursed. But I think that we will have some addition to that. So I say all of that to say our recommendation is that we, at a future meeting, bring back a resolution for council's consideration to transfer the $1,274,000 from the general fund to the CIP fund. Any questions before I move on regarding that? Okay. So this slide shows the results for the general fund for 2019, the first column being the actual revenues and expenditures compared to the fiscal 2019 budget. And we can see that our revenues for the year exceeded budget by $740,000, and our expenditures came in under budget by $530,000. Then we also show the actual results for fiscal year 2018, and comparing that to actual results for 2019, we see that our 19 revenues exceeded 2018 by $249,000. Our expenditures came in under budget compared to 18 by $1.7 million. But we also have a transfer, and in 19 we met the budget. In comparing 19 to 18, we actually had $2,200,000 more than 18. So the million that you see in fiscal 18 transfer, that's really to the public assistance fund, and we had that same transfer in 19 for the same amount. The additional $2.2 million is the support of the general fund support of tourism. That was transferred in 19, but in 18 actually paid out of the general fund. So in 19, we had a net change in fund balance of almost $1.3 million compared to the $1.5 million in 2018. And then on the next slide, I show the variance of fiscal 19 actual to the budget. And you can see that the larger amount of revenue over budget came from other local taxes, categorical state aid, and miscellaneous. And I have to the right of that slide, I show what the variants were for the other local taxes. So you can see that our business license came in over budget by about $358,000. Meals came in over by about $155,000. Bank stock taxes was over budget by $110,000, and business license by $21,000. Those overages in that category were offset by recordation taxes coming in under budget by about $88,000. And then in categorical state revenue, that was over budget by about $93,000. That was primarily related to additional funding for streets and sidewalks, about $60,000 of that, and to a lesser extent, revenue exceeded budget for 599 funding, and 599 funding is funding for public safety, and that was by $14,000, and our sales tax for education came in over budget by $17,000. Now, miscellaneous came in over $74,000, and miscellaneous is really a category where either the revenue is small in amount or infrequent enough that it doesn't merit its own object code or line. And so there were many small items in that category. I'm just going to highlight the larger items, and that would have been the school surplus for fiscal 18. They underestimated that, and we had about another $28,000 that we recorded in 19. We also do a true-up with the health department at the end of the year, and so as a result of that true-up, we recorded additional or reimbursement of about $15,000. There were also items that offset these overages, items that came in under budget, and the largest two of those was use of property and then the non-categorical aid. And the use of property came in under $95,000. The majority of that was related to the Prince George parking garage. A portion of that, about $37,000, was related to the free parking that was offered in the previous holiday season. And the remainder of that was related to some issues with the equipment and also adjusting to some new software changes and the transition, the implementation stage of that. In non-categorical aid, the $68,000 is related to the grantor's tax or tax on deeds that came in under budget. Then the next slide compares the 2019 expenditures or actual expenditures to the budget. The largest portion of that's in education. That would be the school surplus. And then behind that is the general administration at almost $165,000. And that primarily is related to a vacancy in the city manager's office. And then we have public safety coming in. That was primarily in the fire department, and community development was planning and economic development. Then we look at the variances in revenue between 19 actual results and fiscal 2018. Property tax is one of the largest over, where we received more than 18. The majority of that was in real estate taxes at $583,000 over budget, and I would attribute about $550,000 of that to the increase in the tax rate and about $30,000 just increase in assessments. We also had, in that category, had business personal property that increased or was over increased from 18 by $61,000. The intergovernmental at $161,000 is largely due to an increase in sales tax for education. And then the recovered cost at $165,000 is the utilities transfer to the general fund of amounts to cover services that they receive from the general fund, including materials and supplies, and also for a GIS position and a landscape position. And then the largest negative variance was in other local taxes, and the majority of that relates to the $1.1 million in the $2 lodging tax that used to be recorded in the general fund and is now being recorded in the tourism fund. But in addition to that, we had recordation taxes that came in under budget at $164,000, and offsetting those two negative variances, we had meals tax that came in $246,000 more than 2018, and business license at $280,000 more. Then on the next slide, we look at the expenditure variance from 19 to 2018. You can see at the bottom, the net of that, 2019 was over the 2018 expenses, or more than the 2018 expenses by $524,000. That is a kind of a netting effect. The $2.2 million that we see as a result of the transfer to the tourism fund that used to be expended in the general fund. And then I'm going to take you through a few slides to just explain the major variances in the other categories. And looking at the general government administration, that came in at $102,000 more. And the Commissioner of Revenue's Office and Information Technology, those increases are largely due to additional staff. The Commissioner of Revenue gained an auditor. Information Technology gained a GIS position. So that would include the salaries, related benefits, and other costs like training and supplies that tend to increase when we have additional employees. The Real Estate Assessor's Office is also related to increased salary and also training, for instance, maintaining CPEs for the real estate licensings. The Clerk of Council relates to a vacant position that was filled, as does the increase in the city shop. And then again, the City Manager's Office that came in under budget is related to a vacancy. In public safety, we see that 2019 increased over 2018 by about $510,000. And I list out the increases there. The police department, we saw salary and benefits increase by $112,000. They did gain 3 additional police officers in 2019. Unfortunately, they still had some vacancies, and they used the overtime to fill those vacancies. We also increased their budget last year for supplies and uniforms. The fire salary and benefits increased. They did gain 1 additional position. And the regional jail, we see, decreased from 2018. And then in public works, we see an increase of $160,000 compared to the previous year. Again, some of that was in salary and benefits. We also see an increase in electricity that came from the streets division, as well as an increase in cost of garbage collection. Education, of course, the increase there, a total of $643,000 compared to 2018, was an increase in the city's support of school operations, as well as the pass-through of the sales tax for education. Then in community development, we see that we have expenditures coming in less than 2018. The $3.3 million there that I'm showing is, again, related to items that previously were expended from the general fund that now are expended from the tourism fund. And then we also see that we had an increase in the contribution to the Economic Development Authority, and that was to pay for incentives for businesses that had met their performance agreements. And then we had just a little bit more in planning and economic development, and that's majority salary and benefits. And now we look at our cash and investments for the year end. We had $13.3 million in the general fund, $25.1 million in the CIP for a total of $475,000, and the average yield for 2019 on the interest was 2.06%. Yeah. This slide, the line graph, the gray line graph, tracks the amount of surplus for each year from 2015 to 2019. And you can see that we had a peak in 2016 at 2.2 million. And then in 2019, we have about 1.3 million. The blue line shows the amount at which revenues exceeded budget for each year, and the orange line shows the amount by which expenditures came in under budget for each year. And I think what's significant here is you can see in 2018, there's a switch. Prior to that, the majority of the surplus was funded by expenditures coming in under budget. And then in 18, and that carries through to 19, the majority of the surplus is related to revenues that exceed budget. And then on this line graph, the graph to the right, the meals and lodging tax are the yellow line, and real estate is the blue line. In fiscal 2015, the combined meals and lodging is slightly higher than the real estate tax. This holds true into 2017 when it's about level, they're about equal. And then in 2018, real estate is about $200,000 more than the combined meals and lodging. And in 2019, real estate's about $500,000 more. And a portion of that, again, is related to the increase in the tax rate. The cutout to the bottom, on the bottom right, that shows from 2015 to 2019, meals tax increased 7.2%, or $489,000. If you look at the graph above that, the lodging tax, that shows that from 2015 to 2019, the lodging tax increased 2.7%, or $88,000. So I got curious when I looked at this, and I thought, well, what if I look back to 2007, right before the recession? And in doing that, what I found was meals tax increased from 2007 to 2019, 25.5%, or $1.5 million. The lodging tax, however, decreased 24%, or $1 million. And real estate increased 32%, or $2.7 million. And during that time period, we had two rate increases, one for 3 cents in 2013 and one for 3 cents in 2019. Well, after looking, so the total of those three, just those three revenues, is an increase over that time period of $3.2 million. So then I thought, well, I wonder what the total general revenue looked like in that time period. And what I found was from 2007 to 2019, the total revenue increased 8.7%, which equates to $3 million. So, there were some other revenues that went down. And I then looked at general fund expenditures and found over that time period they increased 20%, or about $6 million. So I think that the two slides together kind of show a little bit of change starting to happen in our financial resources. And then this slide compares real estate taxes is a percent of the combined meal and lodging. So in 2007, real estate tax was 83% of meals and lodging taxes. And in 2019, it was almost 105%. And then this slide brings us to the tourism fund. And as you can see in comparing budget to actual, we see that our lodging tax underperformed budget, our sales tax did better than budget. Of course, the transfer and support from the general fund was complied with budget. Expenditures all came in under budget, and our revenues exceeded budget by $2,239,154, and all of that becomes available for the Tourism Development Grant Fund, which in fact Council did award last month. And then with that, we take a look at our utility fund, and I have presented before you the 2019 budget, the 2019 actual, as well as the 2018 actual. And you can, if you look down at the operating income, you see that we did better than budgeted, but not quite as well as we did in 2018. Operating income was $322,000 less than it was in 2018. And then this page really looks at the non-operating revenue and expenses. And again, total non-operating for 2019, we did better than budget, and we did better than 2018. And a lot of that was related to the sale of timber that we had in 2019 that did not occur in 2018. And then we have a transfer in 2018 of $500,000 in support of a CIP project. So before that transfer, income before transfer was $1.5 million for 2019 compared to $1.7 million for 2018. But once we make that transfer, we have a change in net position of $1.5 million compared to $1.2 million in the previous year. So we did very well. And we'll look at our working capital, which at the end of the year was $7.7 million, which was an increase of $1.4 million compared to June of 2018. And with that, I'll just say I do recall that when we were going through the budget process for this current year, we were asked to consider a utility reserve policy when we do the fiscal 21 budget, and we will do that and bring that back to council for consideration. And that brings us to our pension plan. And so the three columns that I'm displaying is the total pension liability, the plan fiduciary net position, and the net pension liability. And I tend to look at the total pension liability is what have we promised to pay. The net position is loosely, what do we have available to pay, and then the net pension liability is the difference between the two. So at the end of the year, we had $9.8 million in net pension liability, and the plan fiduciary net position is a percentage of the total pension liability is 86.1%, which is an increase from last year's 84.7%, and a very good place to be, a very comfortable place to be. The city of Williamsburg also has two other post-employment benefits. That's group life insurance and line of duty act benefits. And the line of duty act benefits are benefits that we're required to pay for public safety personnel that's hurt in the line of duty, and sometimes their family as well. And so at the end of the year, the plan fiduciary net position as a percent of the total OPEB liability is for the group life insurance was 51.22%, which is an increase from the previous year, 48.86%. For the line of duty benefits, that's 0.6%, which is a decrease from the previous year, 1.3%. And that concludes my formal remarks for the report.
Thank you, Ms. Dameron. I defer to my colleagues for questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you like this stuff, don't you?
I do. And I have to be careful to not get too deep in it.
Well, I like that you like this, and then that you do get deep into it.
There's something wrong with me. I don't know.
No. We all have.
Good at your job.
I just want to compliment you on the work that you did in terms of transparency, separating from the general fund, the CIP, That's always been kind of nothing wrong, but this is much more clear way to look at it. So I think that's a good effort. And again, also doing the same thing with the Tourism Development Fund. Now, I think those numbers it's very transparent. People can find it, they can understand it better, so I applaud you on that effort. Just talking about going back to the pension fund, a lot of that is tied to, money goes to the state and it's invested in the pension fund, and it's tied to growth in the market. Have we seen that? I mean, the stock market's gone gangbusters here for the last 2 years. Has that fund seen the same
I don't
results?
remember the exact numbers, but I do believe that there was an increase in their interest investment for the previous year. So I can get back with you on that.
No, I just, that would be fine. Just shoot me an email. I'd
Yeah,
be
sure.
interested to see what kind of growth they've had there. But then if it hasn't grown commensurate to the rest of the market, then who do we call to make sure that we find better ways to reinvest those dollars?
Well, actually, Mr. Pons, we can send you some articles from Richmond Times-Dispatch where they have criticized the administrators of the VRS plan for exactly that, a slower than other funds performance, and criticizing the salaries associated with those at the top as the reason why they're not really incentivized to improve performance. So we'll send you that so you can see it.
But and maybe in that it'll explain how can we, as a municipality, work to protect those funds to make sure that they're achieving that type of growth.
I think the only way that we can is to advocate for closer monitoring with the General Assembly. I know we have our legislative meeting tomorrow. It might be a topic to bring up.
I think we also, I don't disagree with you, but we also need to be careful because the more reward you get in the market comes from the greater risk that you're willing to take. And when you
gotta know when to get
take
out.
risk with pension funds, you can be in a lot of trouble. So.
There's definitely a trade-off there.
Yeah, well, thank you for all your work on this. I appreciate it. And I'm very happy that we have a clean audit.
Thank you, Ms. Dameron and Ms. Wall, for your presentations and for being here today. I may have said this every single year, but it's often so taken for granted for Williamsburg that we have clean audits and even have producing a CAFA report. There's some localities in Virginia that even struggle to get to that point. So even though we do technically a great job, we are still grateful for the professional work that all your staff has done and also for Ann's staff as well. The one slide, I believe it's slide 23.
23.
I'm going to tie in some my comments in terms of
Is that
some of the it's the lodging tax and the meals tax, the graphs.
Okay.
Just tying in some policy comments into it. Obviously there's been a lot of discussions about the Tourism Development Fund. There's maybe still some confusion what the difference may be between the Tourism Council and the Tourism Development Fund. But I think we need to challenge the assumption that because we had passed such a policy that we expect such a quick fix. Right? One of the main reasons why we passed the policy is that we want to ensure to find different ways to engage in public-private partnerships and provide those opportunities so that we can locate other tourism projects and hopefully see a turnaround with those numbers. But I think we need to caution folks and say they cannot be expected to be done right away, especially now because we just awarded our first round of policies. But I want to remind the residents why we're doing this in the first place. It's because of those very numbers. I see lodging taxes have been kind of going down and leveled off within the previous years. What we're trying to do with this policy is to make sure and ensure that with the investments that we're making that we can gear back our revenues towards what we have always enjoyed in decades past. And I think that's just important to point out because I don't want a person to look at that slide and say, oh, wow, what a wasted effort council has done. I think we are exactly engaging the efforts, and it will take time. So I just had another question with regard to the last one, the LODA slide, I think it's slide 30. My general comments is based on my work with the Virginia Municipal League. I was the vice chair for the legislative committee this year. Incredible honor to be chosen by colleagues to do that. We did a working group. We established a working group that looked into potential changes with the Line of Duty Act. I'm not sure how much you've engaged with our state counterparts with it. again, this is VML, so we have kind of our own thing, but have there been discussions with state-level agencies about potential changes into LODA? Obviously, it won't impact us this year, and this is just an audit looking to the previous year, but is there any insight you can share with that?
And not that I'm aware of. I mean, this is this fund is fairly new, trying to fund
Yep.
that, which is one
I think it's very
reason.
worthy.
And then, of course, again, as I mentioned, it's for public safety officials that are hurt in the line of duty. And it's hard to judge the timing of that, but the expenses can be rather significant.
Right.
When they occur.
So I guess this is something we could bring up again tomorrow if it's needed. But obviously something we'll continue to monitor, especially with the new General Assembly coming in. So anything else? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, and nice to have your enthusiasm and diligence, always looking after our numbers, and appreciate the clean CAFR. Thank you.
A couple of questions or comments. On the audit report, for next year, when we talk about the profile of the city and Williamsburg Redevelopment and Housing Authority, can we talk about or just note that the board was increased by those two public positions? It's no longer just city council.
Sure,
Just
sure.
to get that updated information. And then
Oversight there.
looking at the graphs, which really were both presentations in terms of comparing room and meal taxes to real estate taxes, maybe next year we can get a little more breakdown, because the real estate taxes really would be a function of the tax rate, the assessments, and the base. And maybe a feel for, is the base growing, which is a big contributor?
Well, I think what we'll see in the upcoming year, we'll see bigger growth in the assessed value, not necessarily the base, but the assessed value. Certainly, in this previous year, we saw more of an impact of a rate increase, and that's because I know that in 19, I want to say we were not quite at 1% increase in assessment that year.
So I'm thinking the assessed value of the portfolio, let's say, is also a function of, how many properties we've got in there
Sure.
now.
Sure.
So if we see developments, especially in High Street.
We certainly can include that, absolutely.
What is that contributing versus the individuals looking at their own
Sure.
assessments? And then on the lodging, how much of that decline is because we're losing product?
Right.
How many units are we using? What about people that are converting their hotels to apartments? Is that coming off the product line? So that may explain some of that.
Sure, we can include that.
And then what the softball question was, when we added that position in the Commissioner of Revenue's office, the auditor, we said it would pay for itself. How many months did it take to pay for itself?
Oh, I don't know if I know off the top of my head an exact amount, but it certainly has paid for itself now. And I don't know that, I guess we could go back and look, but I think you really see that, a lot of their taxes, like business licenses, due March 1st, so it doesn't necessarily come in steady. So
It was much faster than expected.
right, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good return on investment there.
Well, Ms. Wall, thank you very much for your team's work with the city. We greatly appreciate that. Ms. Dameron, everything you do, your presentation and your oversight of the finance is very important, but a lot of work goes on behind the scenes that even people on council don't see. We have the audit committee. We have two other great members of that committee, Gwen Whitaker and Bob Taylor, who volunteer their time and review the CAFR, and I think do a pretty great evaluation of the information they get, and I hope you both find that helpful. And then, of course, to Vicki Herrick, who does a tremendous job holding the ship together as it sails along. And
She really does coordinate the audit process, and all of these numbers that you see, they have to get in the general ledger somehow, and Vicki does a great job of tracking all that. So.
Well, I just ask that you pass along our appreciation to her for all of her hard work, because this is one of the most important things that the city is responsible for. We talk about the city's general fund and the city's surplus. I mean, it belongs to the people of Williamsburg. And it's just our responsibility to look after it and make sure it's stewarded appropriately, and your work is a critical component of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mayor, one thing that we should point out is that as we start budget preparations for next year, next week, by the way, you can expect to see an increase in our utility budget for electricity simply because Barbara spends so many hours after dark in her office. And we're not prepared for that increase.
Well, we noticed that she seemed to have a spring in her step today, and it must be because the budget process is starting again.
Right.
The next item of new business, appointments to boards and commissions. Do we have a motion?
We do, sir. I move that City Council reappoint Nancy Carter to the Historic Triangle Bicycle Advisory Committee for the term to end December 31st, 2022. Also to appoint Greg Granger to the Planning Commission for a term to end December 31st, 2023. And that City Council appoint Marcia Leibel to the Architectural Review Board for the term to end December 31st, 2023, and Robert Lane to the Board of Zoning Appeals for a term to end December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Fryling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
I believe we have another appointment to make.
Yes, sir. I move that City Council adopt the nomination of Julie Hummel for reappointment to the Williamsburg James City County School Board for a term starting January 1st, 2020 and ending December 31st, 2023.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Fryling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
This brings us to the open forum section of today's meeting. Anybody who'd like to address council, we'd ask that you come forward, state your name and address, and keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less.
A lot of people.
Seeing no one, come back to council. Do we have any items today for closed session?
No, sir.
Do we have any other business? No?
I'd
We
like
have
to
a
make
motion.
Make a motion that we adjourn.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Fryling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
We're adjourned.